Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Raisina Ideas Pod. My name is Esther Tamara from Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, and I'm very pleased to have with us two very distinguished experts. We have, firstly, Usta Kaitesi, the CEO of Rwanda Governance Board. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have with us Shoko Noda, the resident representative of UNDP India.
Thank you.
And in this session, we'll be looking at the topic social lift, gender, and development, and how we can go about creating an inclusive and equitable future for our society. So let me cut through the chase and start with you, Usta. Right now, we're facing multitudes of crises. First, we have the pandemic. Now we have the food crisis, energy crisis, and obviously also the climate crisis. I want to get your assessment, a scorecard, if you will, of how well have we fared into taking into account, gender considerations in our crisis policy responses?
Well, I think raising it to a scorecard level would not be most appropriate, but I should say that anything gender exclusive has diverse effects. Most of the crisis interventions, I'll just give an example. When we all were intervening in COVID-19, we set up very particular hospitals for COVID intervention. But when it came to women who were pregnant and delivering children in those particular COVID centers, you realize that there was a gender conscious element that lacked, because many of those infrastructures were not maternity related in different aspects. And I think generally when you look at the energy crisis, just observe the energy crisis and relate with how many women actually become victims of that. When you go back to areas of conflict in Africa, sexual violence is going to be very prominent in those kinds of crises, but also the fact that women go out of their homes that are not necessarily that safe to go and find firewood. That becomes even less secure for them. And therefore, the energy crisis is probably more pertinent to the lives of women and how it affects them. But also the fact that the time it takes for them to get, even in the absence of a real crisis, the time it takes for them to find firewood and be able to put the food on the table affects women disproportionately with men. So I would say that we are yet to really improve on how we do a gender balance or a gender equity view. And I think it makes all the sense. 36%, global parliaments, different countries in the world do not have women representatives. At least less than 30%, is what women representatives are in parliaments. And that's where policies happen. That's where the legislative structure happens. And therefore, I think in scoring, we are still at the lower level of being inclusive enough, of understanding how these crises affect us differently. And I think at the backbone of that, really, we have to first understand how the different crises as they happen affect women and men, of course, and the youth at the same time. So I think I've not really related to the score element that you wanted, but I guess we have so much yet to do to be able to capture the impact of the crisis, but also the experience, the actual experience that women and men go through differently. And that is mostly what is going to inform how best we shape the next approaches to conflict and crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you touched on something that I'd like to go back on later about political participation of women. But for the meantime, I'd like to turn to Shoko. So how do we then mainstream gender consideration in our policy responses? And as Usta said, it's very critical that we have women-led development of policies. So how do we go about doing that?
So to mainstream gender, it's not only about the policy, the content itself, but we have to remember to allocate first resources. This is critical. Policy itself really doesn't solve this. For the same reason, unless we have the capability and conscious efforts, we also would not be able to implement even the most beautifully crafted policy on earth. And I come to the point that who is actually implementing, who is making policies, who is implementing these policies. In the end, they are all individuals and they all have family. So it's not only about, how do you say, to have world class policies, but we also have to be conscious that those bias that is created at the simplest unit in the society has to be really addressed. And then when it comes to policy, it has to be evidence-based.
Yep.
We have to look at the data. And for that, India, I think I've been in India for 4 years, and I see India as a SDG champion. They have been publishing so-called SDG index
Yes.
to rank all the states, which state is doing what. So it's creating a very healthy competitions. When I meet those chief ministers or chief secretaries at state level, they all ask, so how can we do better? And then that comes to the capacity also of collecting data, collecting evidence. And when it comes actually not at the state level, but the district level, and that is where you can really see which sector and which district are lagging behind. We just supported Haryana state to publish the state level or district level SDG index. And that is where I saw stark discrepancies, even, for example, in the education sector or health sector, where some districts are lagging behind. And that is where we need to have targeted policy interventions with appropriate resource allocation.
You mentioned two very critical things, which is resources and second, implementation. And this is where I'd like to bring Usta back into the conversation, because Shoko, you mentioned that in order to create policy responses that are not gender biased, well, then women needs to be part of the decision-making process. And in Rwanda, you are leading globally in women political participation. I think some 60% of your MPs are women. So what did you do right? And what advice can you share with us all, the rest of the world?
Well, I think it starts from the strategic orientation. There must be a political will to be inclusive intentionally. And when Rwanda chose to reconstruct itself, the political will was there to be inclusive. When you consider the three strategic choices that at the backbone of reconstructing Rwanda, choosing to stay together is a core element. We have chosen our unity and our togetherness. And that means that you cannot neglect the 52% of what women are in building the country. So the political will is core at the beginning of intentionally creating policies and laws that allow inclusion. The second element that I think Rwanda is consistently done well is with a political will, creating the legal environment. We have a historical environment where women were excluded intentionally. A woman would not go to trade except with the authorization of her husband. The intention to remove that legal requirement was very specific. Very specific gender-based violence laws were introduced by women members of parliament and voted into law. And then children for women were never allowed to be Rwandans except if the fathers of those children were not known. Our nationality law was adjusted and introduced the right-based approach for women. So the legal framework is also core to permit women to be part of the project. And I think she mentioned it right, to be intentional on financing. So we have a gender budget system, gender-sensitive budget approach, and each budget statement has to have a gender statement that is specific on how women are going to be impacted, but on how the funding is going to affect women and men in terms of that approach. So financing is also very key, and intentionally making it part of the national budget and being able to assess it. And lastly, I think creating institutions like the Rwanda Governance Board, like the Gender Monitoring Office. We have a very specific Gender Monitoring Office that looks at how much gender inclusiveness is at the core of delivery. So there is bringing women on the table, giving them the opportunity, having the political will for us to be involved. There is having the right legal framework that is enabling, but also eliminating those forms of discrimination that have existed in terms of concepts. And of course, as I said, women, like anyone else, to be included and to allow their participation. And it's very fundamental in the Rwandan constitution. Every Rwandan has a right to participate in the development of the country.
Yes.
Now, it is the duty of the state to establish strategies and mechanisms to allow everyone to participate in the development of the country. So I would say that's what has gone right in Rwanda, but also allowing women to participate, to do the job. And as you said, yes, 61% are parliamentarians, and there is very clear gender parity at the cabinet level. But there are some areas that we are still yet to really catch up on those participation elements. And that's what the Gender Monitoring Office and the Rwanda Governance Board brings in forms of data, to inform government, to inform participation, that there is a gap that still is yet to be filled.
So, Usta, you mentioned something which is very important for action, which is political willingness. Now, talking about action, this decade is very critical that we actually have action, because the 2030 SDGs agenda is looming up in the corner. So, Shoko, please tell us about how gender equality can be part of our pursuit of the SDGs.
So, in order to mainstream gender, I think SDGs really provide an excellent menu for all the development work that we do. And of course, we do have SDG 5, which is dedicated for gender. But when you look at the poverty reduction, when you look at the education, health, water, energy, or climate change, there's always that gender elements, which we should not forget. And we should definitely look at women's roles in each goal, women's participation in each goal, and see where there are gaps. Whether this is the gap in school attendance, if there's a gap in labor force participation, this is where the policy should be focused on. And in order to really accelerate SDGs, now the digital comes is a very critical role to play. And we do see that there is the gender digital divide is happening. Also, especially at the older women, I think there is a complete kind of sometimes disconnect from the rest of the world and rest of the digital world. So it is extremely important to educate and familiarize those, especially women who are left behind, to catch up through this digital technology.
And I got the message both from you, Usta, and you, Shoko, that gender should be in every element of consideration in everything that we do. But my perspective, that requires changing mindsets, because most of the time, especially in societies that are conventionally or traditionally has been very patriarchal, they don't challenge that mindset. So Usta and Shoko, just very briefly, can you tell us about how we can go about changing those mindsets in these societies?
Well, I think it's starting from, as I said earlier, intentionally being inclusive, but also challenging negative discourse. People understand the negative discourse, only that gender-related negative discourse has been tolerated for a very long time. Some communities are not conscious about that. So even intentionally choosing to say, no, we do not tolerate this. From the softest way of saying it, we don't tolerate this kind of discourse that is discriminatory. And I would say that you should look at that from the perspective of no discrimination in a general sense, because it comes to gender, but in the end, when you do not tolerate discrimination, it becomes easier not to tolerate gender discrimination either way. So I would say challenging the discourse, but also being intentionally engaging. Positive masculinity is also a good way to go. informing and engaging and challenging the perspectives that men hold on women in different ways, but also being able to create role models for women. You know, as I said earlier, the fact that women are playing in this world, there are so many things that women are admiring, and many are admiring also on women in action. So I would say challenging the discourse, as I said earlier, positive masculinity is core, but also enabling women, really. Enabling women to be out playing, doing the kind of jobs that they are able to do, and allowing these generations to learn and engage. So it's going to be an engagement journey. It has to be an intentionally engaging journey. And of course, that is constructed by inclusion. The element of inclusion is going to be core and intentional to allow us to do what we want to do.
Okay, and then to you, Shoko, just very briefly.
Yes, I think Rwanda is showing an excellent example to the world to have those female political leaders that all of us see, not only the children, especially girls in Rwanda, but around the world. We see that, yes, it is possible to have more inclusive society. So definitely to have more female political leaders is one. I think the education in school is also very important for girls to feel more confident. I think once the sense of confidence is in all of us, we can really overcome a lot of stereotype challenges.
Okay, wonderful. So there you have it. Raisina's Ideas Pod on social lift, gender, and development. Several key themes here. First, making sure that we have the political willingness to pursue this agenda. Second, allocating resources, but not only allocating it, but actually implementing and and mobilizing those resources. And with that, let me end here. And thank you so much, Usta and Shoko, for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.